Hello everyone, welcome to StudyIQ. In this lecture, we will be discussing the second chapter of the economic survey. The second chapter deals with the GST, Goods and Services Tax. The title of the chapter goes like this: a new exciting bird's eye view of the Indian economy through the GST. So from the title itself, it is very clear that Indian economy has changed a lot, or GST has brought about a major change in the Indian economy, and through the eyes of the GST, the view of the economy itself has changed, and that is what the chapter discusses all about. The chapter begins with a quote, and then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. So what does it mean? A new world has evolved. So in case of Indian economy, a new world or a new economy itself has evolved with the rolling out of the GST. So GST has brought about a new economy into the picture. In the introduction, we will see that first of all, a 50% increase in the number of indirect taxpayers. So one impact is increase in the number of taxpayers and thereby an increase in the tax base in the economy. And this 50% increase has happened because there has been a large number of voluntary registrations. So first thing, 50% increase in indirect taxpayers. So this is because of voluntary registrations. And what is the reason for this voluntary registrations? Because even the small sellers or small enterprises wants to avail themselves input tax credit. So in order to avail the facility of input tax credit, they make voluntary compliances or registrations. And second thing is that GST base among the states is closely linked to the size of the economies. Earlier, before the rolling out of the GST, one major confusion among the states were that prosperous states argued that with the rolling out of GST, they will be losing revenue. So that was one major concern with regard to prosperous states. So GST has proved that it is a wrong understanding. So what does GST really exhibit? The GST base among the states which is closely linked to the size of the economy, which means that if the size of the economy of a particular state is big, or if a state has a wider economy, prosperous economy, the tax base of that economy is also high. So there is a direct proportion or relationship between the size of the economy and also the GST tax base. So second point is that tax base and the size of the economy are proportional. Third important factor, the GST data suggests that a strong correlation exists between export performance and the state's standard of living. What does it mean? It means that if the quantum or volume of exports of a state is higher, more is the prosperity. So export and the prosperity has a direct relationship. More prosperous state tend to export more. The fourth factor is with regard to the egalitarian nature of Indian trade. So India's exports are unusual in that the largest firms account for much smaller share of exports than in other comparable countries. So it is more egalitarian. Egalitarian nature of Indian trade. In India, the largest firms accounts for only a smaller percentage of the exports, which means there is a place for even small traders or small firms. And in case of India, one thing we must remember is the role of MSMEs. MSMEs have a major stake in the trade and also export of the countries. So trade and exports, MSMEs have a major role. So it means that India is more egalitarian. Trading opportunity or export opportunities given for everyone. But when we compare it with other countries, the situation is the other way around. The largest firms account for larger percentage of trade. We will discuss this point in detail in this chapter itself. Now let us see the next point. Next is regarding the formality of employment. So formality is defined by two things. One is social security benefits and the second one is whether the employer comes under the GST net. So these two things define the formality of employment in the economy. And according to the GST data, it shows that according to this criteria of social security, 31% of the Indian workforce belong to the formal sector. And when it comes to the criteria of GST net, 53% of Indian workforce come under the GST net. So this is much greater than what was believed. So this percentage of workforce who are in the formal sector, they were much more than what was believed. Now let us analyze the chapter in detail. As we said in the beginning, with the rolling out of the GST, a new economy itself has emerged. So the world around us, or the Indian economy itself, has changed with the rolling out of the GST. So there are so many things that are associated with the GST that are really appreciable. Let us see them. First of all, GST was able to create one Indian market. So one market was possible. So one market concept was possible with the rolling out of the GST. Secondly, it has expanded the tax base. The tax revenue of the government has expanded or increased with the rolling out of the GST, with more voluntary compliances and more taxpayers. Thirdly, it helped in fostering the cooperative federalism. So cooperative federalism is a concept where the union and the states are in cooperation, or there is mutual cooperation between the union and the states. And how did GST help in cooperative federalism? We have a GST council, and this GST council has representatives from both the center as well as the states. So there are representatives from center and states. Decisions are made by majority. So which means that if the GST council, and one more thing, GST council is the major decision making body under the GST. So if GST council has to pass or make some important decisions, it is necessary that not only the center but also the states should agree with it. So the approval of the center as well as the states are required, and this is one way by which we can improve the cooperative federalism of our country. So GST has obviously helped in building a better cooperative federalism in the country. And again, coming to information that the GST has passed to the public, a vast repository of information has been created with the GST. Before the rolling out of the GST, many information was not revealed. So after the GST was rolled out, many information got revealed because we have sufficient adequate data with us. So in that way, it has helped in the revealing of information. For example, we have already discussed about the formality of employment in the economy. But before the rolling out of the GST, it was not possible for us to get this data. So now we have sufficient data, and this is enough that we can generate information from that data. Now coming to this facts in detail. The first one, a large increase in the number of indirect taxpayers. So we have already seen with the rolling out of the GST, the number of indirect taxpayers has increased. And what is the impact? When the number of indirect taxpayers has increased, it has created a wider tax base in the economy. And wider tax base in the economy means that more tax revenue for the country. So with more tax revenue, government can undertake better developmental activities in the economy. So it can be properly utilized in the production process, which can further increase the GDP of the country, thereby increasing the rate of growth and development of the economy. So the indirect taxpayers increased, tax base increased, the tax revenue also increased. And what is the reason for this improvement or increase in the indirect taxpayers? One important reason is the input tax credit. In order to avail the input tax credit, it is necessary that one has to register with the GST. So in order to avail the facility of input tax credit, even the small entrepreneurs will go for it. Again, the distribution of GST base among the states is closely linked to the state GDP or gross state domestic product. It means that if a state has higher GDP, if the state GDP is high of a particular state, the GST distribution will also be high. So before the rolling out of GST, many states argued that they will be in a loss of revenue if GST is rolled out. But this did not really happen. So what has really happened is that if a state has more GDP, what is GDP? Gross domestic product. GDP is the monetary value of all the final goods and services produced in an economy during a financial year. So it is within that economy. That is one important point with regard to GDP. So this is within the economy. And in case of a state, the monetary value of all the final goods and services produced within that state, that is the state GDP. So if the state GDP is high for a particular state, the GST is also high, or the distribution of GST is also high. A state having more GDP will get more GST contribution or more GST dividend also. So that is what the GST has proved. A state which has less GDP will have lesser in the form of GST distribution as well. So GST did not hamper the revenue of any states. It is divided according to the production or size of the economy, or according to the GDP of that particular state economy. And thirdly, international exports of states suggest that there is a strong correlation between export performance of the state and the standard of living. It means that if a state is performing well with regard to international trade or exports, if a particular state has more export, that state's prosperity will also be high, or standard of living will also be high. So there is a direct relationship between the prosperity or the standard of living of a particular state and the quantum or volume of the state's exports. Next, coming to the egalitarian nature of the Indian firms. So the Indian trade structure shows that there is an unusual trade structure. In case of other countries, when we compare it with other countries like Brazil, Germany, etc., for those countries, the largest firms account for maximum percentage of trade. But in case of India, it is exactly the opposite. So in India, it is like the largest firms account for only a smaller share. So the trade structure of India says that large firms accounts for small percentage of exports. So it means smaller firms have a role in the exports or trade. Especially we should remember the role of MSMEs. This is very important. In case of India, MSMEs play a major role in the export structure of our country. Next is with regard to the internal trade. Internal trade means trade within the country or trade between different states. So the internal trade of India is about 60% of the GDP, which is higher than last year's estimation. Again, coming to an important point which we have already discussed, the formality of Indian employment. So here we will see that formality of employment is defined by two criteria. One is whether the employee gets any social security benefits, and the second one is whether the employer comes under the GST net. As we have already discussed, it is much greater than believed. So earlier in India, we believed that majority of the population or the workforce comes under the unorganized sector or the informal sector of the economy. But here we will see that if we take these two criteria, first one, social security benefits. Around 31% of Indian workforce enjoys social security benefits. And also, coming to the GST net, 53% comes under the GST net. So we can say that the formality of employment or the number of workforce, the percentage of workforce that comes under the formal sector or the organized sector of the economy is much more than what is believed. Again, coming to the taxpayers. According to the statistics, there were 9.8 million unique GST registrants. This figure 9.8 million, this is just slightly a little more than the old indirect tax registrants. But what we have seen in under the GST, there is about 50% increase in the number of indirect taxpayers, and this data says that it is 9.8 million, and this is only a slightly more number than the previous indirect tax registrants. Why this is contradicting? Let us see what is the reason. So previously what had happened, there were many number of taxes. We have seen that 17 indirect taxes were subsumed under the GST. So there were around 17 taxes existing before GST was rolled out. So what will happen? An indirect taxpayer may have registered in more than 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 taxes. So there were 17 taxes, and there is every chance that an indirect tax might have registered himself with 1 or 2 or more than that number of taxes. And now with the rolling out of the GST, the number is 9.8 million. But here what we must understand, this is only one tax. GST is unique tax. This is just one tax. So a person cannot register with another tax. So when we avoid this double counting, triple counting, etc. which existed before the rolling out of GST, we should come to a conclusion that there has been a 50% increase in the number of indirect taxpayers. So hope this idea is clear with you. Now the profile is also very interesting. The profile of new filers. So business to consumer transactions account for only 17%. So B2C, business to consumer, it is merely 17%. And what contributes the maximum? B2B transactions, that is business to business transactions. This account for around 34% of the total tax. Now coming to different states, Maharashtra, UP, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, etc. These are the states which have the greatest number of GST registrants. So with regard to greatest number of registrants, they are Maharashtra, UP, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, etc. And when it comes to an increase, so UP and West Bengal have seen the largest increases in number of tax registrants. So number of tax registrants high in Maharashtra, UP, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, but increase high in UP and West Bengal. So coming to the first point, that is the number of tax registrants are high in Maharashtra, UP, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, etc. What can be the reasons for that? Most of them are traders. So more trading activity, manufacturing activity takes place in these states. So that is the reason they have more indirect tax registrants under the GST. Now again coming to the state-wise share of the total GST base. We have seen that GST will be distributed among various states. So coming to that state-wise share of GST base, the top states are Maharashtra accounting for 16%. Second one, Tamil Nadu accounting for 10%. And thirdly, Karnataka, which accounts for 9%. UP, which accounts for 7%. Gujarat, which accounts for 6%. What we will notice here, earlier we have seen that the states which has the largest number of GST registrants, these are Maharashtra, UP, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, etc. And when it comes to states which receive higher proportion of the GST base, they are again the same states, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, UP, Gujarat, etc. So what does it mean? There is a relationship between the number of tax registrants and also the distribution of GST base. So what can be the conclusion which can be made out of it? The more number of tax registrants, the more will be the state's share of the GST. So this is directly related. One more conclusion that can be drawn from this figures is that the state's share in the GST base is almost perfectly correlated with its share in the state GDP. So what does it mean? It means that biggest tax bases will seem to be in the biggest producing states. If a state produces more, if the state's GDP is high, if a state has more GDP, it will also have more GST base or the share of the GST base. So there is a direct relationship between the state's GDP and also the share of GST base. So this is an important fact. Why? Because before rolling out of the GST, many states opposed GST, saying that they will lose revenue, saying that with the rolling out of GST, they will be getting lesser revenue compared to the previous system. So especially states like Punjab, Haryana, etc. had come out with this argument. So it has been 1 year since the GST has been rolled out, and it has proved that the state's GDP and the share of GST base are directly correlated, and there is no revenue loss for any state because of the GST. Now coming to the 5 categories of firms under the GST based on their annual turnover. The first one is below threshold. Below threshold. These firms have an annual turnover of less than 20 lakhs. The second one is below composition limit. So this is below composition. They have an annual turnover of within 20 lakhs and 100 lakhs. Third one is small and micro entrepreneurs, SMEs. So they have an annual turnover of 1 to 5 crore. Fourth one is medium entrepreneurs who have a turnover of 5 to 100 crore. And the fifth one is large firms who have turnover of above 100 crore. So what is the irony here? Looking at this 5 classification, we will understand that the first classification, that is below threshold, whose turnover is less than 20 lakh, they account for 32% of the total firms. So the first category, that is the below threshold, they account for 32% of the total number of firms in the country. And coming to the largest one, that is large entrepreneurs, they account for merely 1%. So those firms who have a turnover of more than 100 crore a year, they account for only 1%. And one more thing is that this 1% of the firms have 66% of the total turnover in the country. So see how skewed is this ratio. 1% of the large entrepreneurs makes 66% of the total turnover in the country in a year, and also they account for 54% of the total tax liability. So what does it mean? It means that the structure is skewed. The 1% who accounts for the larger entrepreneurs, they contribute 54% of the tax revenue. Also they account for 66% of the total turnover in the country. Again, one more important thing, the small firms who account for less than 20 lakh. So the small firms have a turnover of less than 20 lakh per annum. They seems to be equally involved in selling to customers as well as to firms, which means that the small firms in the economy, they are involved in B2B business and also B2C, where B2C is business to consumers and B2B is business to business. So they have an equal role in both B2B as well as B2C. But when it comes to medium and large firms, medium firms are those firms which have a turnover of 5 to 100 crore. The range is 5 to 100 crore and large firms more than 100 crore. So when it comes to large firms and medium firms, they show a much greater presence in B2B transactions, which means they have lesser B2C, business to consumer transactions. They have more B2B transactions. What is B2B and B2C? You need to have a clarity in order to understand this point. I will give you an example. If a shopkeeper, he is selling directly to the consumer, we can say that it is B2C. And if a shopkeeper is selling to another shopkeeper, we can say that it is B2B. So that is the difference. Large and medium firms account for more B2B transaction. That means that they are not selling directly to the consumers. They have a majority of business wherein which they sell to other businesses, not directly to the consumers. But the small entrepreneurs or the small firms, they sell both to the consumers and also to the business. So their proportion or share to the business as well as to the consumers are almost the same or equal. You need to have a clarity on this. Also coming to small businesses, we said that they are involved in B2C as well as B2B. Especially when we take the case of B2C businesses, an entrepreneur or a firm who is selling directly to the consumers, under the GST regime, they want to be registered under the GST. Why? Because they buy from large entrepreneurs. Suppose a person has a shop. So from where he will purchase the materials, he will purchase from wholesalers. So the retailer would obviously be purchasing from the wholesaler. And what the retailer will do, he will sell it directly to the consumers. So in case of that retailer, under the GST regime, he will want to register himself. Why? Because he will be buying from large firms, and if they are registered, that is, if the retailer is registered under the GST, he can avail the facility of input tax credit, and if he is not registered under the GST, he will not get this facility of input tax credit. So definitely this retailer will want to register under the GST regime. So that is the reason why the number of indirect taxpayers has increased under the GST regime.